Hey everyone, I'm Jasmine.
And I'm Nemo, and we're the hosts of the 4 Degrees to the Streets podcast.
Well, welcome back everyone to season 3, episode 1. We're going to be talking about the future of work. Nemo is here with me in LA. I made the move from Jersey to LA a few months ago. Super exciting. How does it feel to be in LA, Nemo?
It feels great. I was just telling you, I haven't been here in like 7 years. It's just wild. As a former West Coaster, it's nice to be back and nice to see LA for the first time.
So we're here at WTF Media Studios in Hollywood, and we're using their space, and we're really happy that they have us here. So we'll jump into the episode now. We're going to talk about the future of work.
Yeah, and one thing too, over the summer, you all have probably seen us posting reels of different cities. We've been outside. So we have one on Newark, not Newark. Yes. See, I can't even say it like how I used to say it.
Because you've been out of Jersey too long.
I know, but Jersey folk corrected me on my first day, and they're like, Newark is in Delaware. Mm-hmm. We have one in Hoboken, Chicago, and San Francisco. And so please, send us a message for the number 4 Degrees Pod and let us know what other cities you want to see, because we're going to stay on the move.
We got one coming up for Vegas, maybe.
Yes. Right. So today we're going to talk about the future of work. This is probably a term that a lot of people have been hearing since COVID in 2020. And we're going to really define what it means, who's interested in what the future of work looks like. We're going to compare some cities that have changed a lot during the pandemic, what that meant for their population growth and their economic development and what you see. And we're also just going to share some takeaways of things that we hope people continue to think about as we do enter this new era 2+ years post the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. So we'll start with, what does work look like prior to COVID? I think what's important is that we realize that in the past 2 going on 3 years, all the conversations have been COVID. What has COVID done? How's COVID changed? How's your life been impacted? And so we're not going to make this episode about coronavirus. This episode is about life kind of post-COVID, if we want to use that as a term. We're kind of using the pandemic as a marker in time, similar to how you would use like a war as a marker in time, or like the great financial crisis of 2008 as like a pre and post time. So we're kind of using it as a time marker, and it's not going to be the focus of the whole episode.
Right. So I hope we don't see that little CDC flag at the bottom of this episode. Like, make sure you verify your information. And it's like, we're not even talking about that. Not even talking about it.
So we'll talk about life pre-2020 and what work looked like pre-2020. And so really everyone was going into their office or their workplace 5 days a week. I was going in 5 days a week, whether I was going to school or going to work. You were in person 5 days a week. I think the Gallup poll has some research on it. So only 8% of companies prior to 2020 offered a fully remote option.
8%. Oh, wow.
So 60% of offices and organizations were in office 5 days a week. 2022, 24% of companies are offering some type of fully remote option. That's almost like 3 times as many. Yeah. And now it dropped down to 23% are just in office 5 days a week. And so you can really see the changes in pre and post. And so this episode is about, okay, if everyone was commuting, if everyone was transporting themselves from where they live to their work site, whether you work in a corporation, in an office, you work for the government, or you work for the grocery store, you were going to that space 5 days a week. How are cities in the world kind of coping with that reduction in patterns and in that travel pattern?
Yeah, and so Deloitte, which is one of the big 4 accounting and like advisory firms, they've done a lot of reporting on this in the last few years in similar firms, and they define the future of work as work, workplace, and workforce. And so work is activities, the value of work, the outcome of work. Workforce is like your skills, your human capabilities, your jobs, what talent you have. And then workplace is really what we want to get into in this episode, where that talks about technology, culture, the physical design, the geographic location, and any sort of collaboration that happens in the place that you work. And so one of the reports that we looked at too, and we'll have this in the show notes, but I believe it was MIT, Stanford, University of Chicago, and then AITM, which is another university in Mexico City. So they really got like a really North American perspective And they found that in New York, pre-pandemic, people were spending about $15,000 a year on shopping, food, just in when they
Just
go
Monday
into
through
the
Friday.
work, right? And then in other places like Alaska and California, they were spending about $12,000.
Wow.
And it's like we all knew that when we went into the office,
I
we
was
spent
saving
money
money. I was so glad to
at
go
home or
home.
in the
Not at
right.
home.
And that's what I was gonna say. It just was truly like a mindset shift. Now I'm like, I have not bought. I can't remember the last time I bought lunch when I've gone into the office. But that's cities were relying on their commuters and their residents and people who came there Monday through Friday. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about sales tax revenue later when we go into the city comparisons. But one of the quotes that I wanted to point out, it was remote work is poised to transform land use law by untethering labor from centralized workplaces and blurring the boundaries between work and home. So basically what we were just saying, when we're at home and we're cooking, preparing our food, maybe that's a different way that we're fueling the economy and how we're, for example, just nourishing our bodies versus going in and patronizing businesses that relied on us. And so when you're thinking from a planning perspective, how does land use grow with that new mindset that people have? And then also, too, some people never went home. I think it's important to acknowledge, especially a lot of service jobs, a lot of agricultural jobs.
Construction.
They've had to keep cities going. And I know in a lot of places that have more agricultural as their main source of industry in the Midwest, like South Dakota, present day, only 22% of their residents work from home or have some sort of work from home component. But you compare it to places like New York and DC, they're about like 42%. And then the highest state that has a share of their days at home is like Vermont. Oregon and California are also pretty high too, where you have a lot of people working from home. So just something to be mindful of that, people always say, oh, return to work. And it's like, well, we were working, we were just at home. And then also some people never went home. So
don't rush me back to the office.
Yeah. Please. So what is work looking like now? What's the landscape?
Yes, I think I'm going to use 2 metrics to kind of think about what work looks like. And I apologize because we are kind of focusing on the 9-to-5er and like the person that's going into like a corporate office or a government building. So like it's definitely not focused on the person who's always been going into the office. It hasn't changed for them since 2019 to 2022. And so the first tenet is office occupancy. So similar to how you think about residential occupancy, right? If you live in a neighborhood in which it's only 70% occupied, how that feels compared to when it's 100% occupied. And so office occupancy basically considers how much of, you say, take an office building, vertical, 10 stories. Those buildings might have 10 tenants or they might have 20 tenants. And so the occupancy measures how many of those units that they have for lease are vacant or are currently under a lease, regardless of whether you're going into your office. Like, so in March 2020, there were all these office spaces leased up. So they technically weren't vacant, even though they were physically empty. That make that difference.
Yeah, no, I don't think I knew that, like but I think it's important, like you said, to know how they define vacancy, even just like it's vacant because no one's there, but on paper.
Yeah, it's actually occupied. And so Jones Lang LaSalle, which is JLL, they're a huge developer, asset manager, capital markets provider. They're just big all over the commercial real estate space. They have a Q2 2022 office outlook report that came out in May 2022, and it looks at rent growth, occupancy, and changes in occupancy across that office spectrum. And so I'm just going to highlight some numbers from it. So pre-pandemic, office occupancy hovered around 10 to 12%. So it was about 88% occupied generally nationwide. In Q2 2022, so Q2, I'm forgetting my...
April through June.
Okay, so at the end of that period, occupancy was 20% nationwide. So it basically doubled. Still, we're now 2 years, quote unquote, out of the pandemic. Occupancy is still at, vacancy is still at 20%. And so you see some regions where it's higher. So San Francisco, 22% vacancy. Houston, 25% vacancy. But then you have places like Cleveland and Philly where they're around 17 or 15%. And so it's interesting to see what makes up those regions. And it might be really good for us to dig into one particular market, which I know we will do later on in this episode. We'll do a case study. But the rest of the report surveyed about 1,000 corporate executives that work in the commercial real estate space. And they just wanted to know what percentage of your office is kind of working hybrid. And so 77% of those offices are in a current hybrid schedule, and 10% of them are planning to completely erase all of their office rentals, their office leases, and go 100% remote.
And that was nationwide or just out of some of the cities?
Out of some of, so this was a nationwide survey, but it was all for commercial real estate firms. So these were other commercial real estate firms that were going to make these changes. And so,
to have a more hybrid model.
And so some of them were considering going, we're not going to have any more leases in the office. We're all going to be 100% remote. So when you think about what that's going to look like when Bank of America decides
to pack it up,
we don't need any more office space. All of our employees have all the technology that they have working from home.
What does that mean? Like, what did you see anything like what?
Yeah, so I think
trends are coming out?
The biggest trend of it is you see those vacancies in what they call Class C office buildings. So very similar to residential, a Class A, glass, beautiful, might have a grocery store on the bottom. An office is the same way. A Class C office space is, your traditional suburban little office park right off the side of 95, something real regular. Yeah. Those have the highest vacancies. So that's why I think places like Houston have higher vacancies than San Francisco, because their office infrastructure is probably older. And I've been to the Houston office, and it is older.
And it's like removed from anything like that you would be going to or passing by.
Exactly. The best performing office assets are the ones that are in central locations that offer a ton of amenities, just like the best performing residential buildings are the ones with washers and dryers and windows and balconies and pools. Yeah. So you have less occupancy in that space.
Yeah. Well, speaking of like comparing to residential, we really wanted to frame like who cares about this and why it matters. And we think about residents. And so that could be residents who are already living in a town that has a lot of office spaces, but office spaces that offer a good quality of life and still things for them to do. They can maybe walk, take the train, have different options of how they get into the office. And then residents in that city, if they are seeing businesses move out, they would care because that could mean less revenue for the city to provide services for them when they are living in that space. And then also residents, because if they don't need to live in the city of where their physical office is, because they're fully virtual or because they're more hybrid, a lot of people are considering moving out for a cheaper cost of living, which we're also going to talk about a lot this season. But for lower cost of living, lower housing, more housing affordability, it's like, well, I don't have to live in downtown. I can move out further. But that's kind of hustling backwards, because as planners, we've been spending the last 60 plus years trying to reverse the effects of sprawl from the prior 60 years.
Yeah.
So,
and I think the environment piece to me is always the most curious piece. So there's two elements of it, right? On the micro level, it's like, okay, I no longer need to live. Let's take LA, for example. Century City is kind of like the main office area. I no longer need to live in Beverly Hills or Mid-City. I can move to the Valley, or I can move to Temecula, like somewhere further east, where I can get a bigger house and spend about the same amount of money. So now when I do have to come into the office, my commute is even longer. So I think about greenhouse gas emissions. I think about climate change. I think about the traffic that it's taking. But on the macro level, when you talk about, and we're going to get into this on our next episode, what cities grew and what cities declined pre and post pandemic, we're looking at cities that have been traditionally tertiary, like Salt Lake City, and outside of Denver, and like Vermont, and places in New England where people weren't necessarily always moving to, became popular during the pandemic because you wanted more space, you wanted more land, and you no longer needed to go to downtown or to Mid-City or wherever to go to work. My concern with that is, what does that do for, right? So in planning, we know that cities have their growth, their population growth all mapped out. And they have the idea of, okay, how many schools do we need? How many roads do we need? All these things. If you have a random spike in your populations, we saw a lot of cities have, how's it impacting your water and sewer systems, your school systems, your bridges and tunnels? Like, is Salt Lake City reasonably prepared to have a 10% increase in population? I don't know. Like, I'm really curious to figure that out.
And I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that Utah, it's based out of university in Utah to kind of assist cities with this, but still, are they able to move fast enough for the growth that they're experiencing and offer really tangible services. And we've talked a lot about people who are deciding where to live based on where they work, but I would think commuters also care about what the future of work looks like, especially if they were already driving a significant distance. We've seen Metro and public transit have a lot of revenue issues since COVID, and had some assistance from the federal government. But again, how long is that? How sustainable is that if people just don't feel the need to take public transit anymore because they don't have to go to work every day,
or it doesn't feel safe? Right, in our last season, we had the females in public space episode. We talked about the San Francisco area where my cousin, she used to ride the train all the time. And then because less people are on the train, now you can see that homeless person or that vagrant or that addict on the train. And it's kind of just, it might literally just be you and him on the car. Like, right. And so it feels more dangerous. Like the danger always existed, but when there's, there's safety in numbers. And so if people are not riding the train as much, then the service for people who would still want to ride it is also like the quality is diminished.
Yeah, it's different. And then other folks that care, businesses that are looking to expand their headquarters, like you said, they want to position themselves in a city that may already have a lot going on. That might be a city that wasn't traditionally like that now, because it's a city that maybe was smaller and more people are moving to it now. Large businesses may consider those places as their new headquarters. And then also city governments, I mentioned sales tax revenue and just declining revenue that happened during the pandemic. They've been able to, again, use federal funds, the American Rescue Plan Act, to do pilots to change things in their cities, to add to economic growth, like you said, really use the pandemic as an accelerator. But those funds are temporary. What will be the things that cities keep in place? And will they keep things in place based on their population and based on the people who are traveling into the city?
So you want to jump into our case studies?
Yeah. So the first city that we looked at, and what we wanted to do with these case studies is look at a city that had an increase in population growth. Specifically, we're using between 2020 and 2021. And then just kind of give a snapshot of what that city's like, what they've experienced in the last year or two. And so Georgetown, Texas, that is a suburb of Austin, Texas, and they had a 10.5% increase in their population from 2020 to 2021.
Wow.
And the census published this report. Again, we'll have it in the show notes. And so their population now is about 75,000. Which compared to a major city doesn't feel like a lot, but like you said, when you're planning for resources and you have an increase in 10%, what does that mean in
a year?
Right, literally in a year. And it was interesting that a lot of people are moving to Georgetown, Texas, because Austin, Texas is actually one of the cities that have seen the most people go back into the office.
Texas wasn't closed. We know Texas was
right.
open.
They were open.
We're open for business.
We're not going to talk about that. And so their sales tax revenue funds about 8.4% of their city budget.
Wow.
And like we've said, a lot of places saw declines, but Georgetown actually saw a 8.4%. They actually saw 14.5% increase year over year. Just looking between 2019, 2020. In 2021, that was the average.
So they saw a 10% increase in population, and then a 14% increase in their
sales tax revenue.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's continuing to grow. And so their sales tax revenue was in 2021 about $3 million, and then in 2019 it was about $2.6 million. So they're seeing the money come in. You can just see what the power and numbers do, and people who are living and patronizing businesses in the city. But it's also important to think about, well, who lives in Georgetown, Texas? If you're listening to this episode and you're like, well, let me see what's going on over there. Like, seems like if a lot of people are moving, this may be just throw a dart on the map and be like, maybe I'll end up there. So according to the census, Georgetown, Texas is 85% white, 19% Hispanic, 6% two or more races, and 4% Black. So just to give a kind of a snapshot of who makes up the majority in Georgetown, Texas, and what that might mean for how they plan resources, or who even has access to live in the town. Because as we know, as being two Black women, regardless of how many degrees or what your income is, it may not always feel comfortable for you to exist in that space. And so even though this is a growing city, I didn't want to ignore the fact of like, okay, well, who makes up that city and who may see people that look like them.
Yeah, and I think Georgetown was on our list of cities in our next episode that is like one of those top places for renters. And we talked about that, like, okay, it might be affordable, yes. Is it walkable? Is it safe from like a crime perspective? Is it safe as a woman, safe as a Black person? Like, what does the equity components look like? So on the flip side of Georgetown, we have San Francisco. And I am so tired of comparing Texas to California. Like, it's so overdone because I think, and I hope that our podcast kind of tries to clear up some of that blurred line. I think the narrative in the media has been everybody left New York and California and moved to Texas and South Carolina. It's like, did we? Did we really do that? And so I'm always I like to go deeper into the numbers because that narrative is just not, yes, they lost population. Let's get into it. So San Francisco, major tech area in the Bay in California. So from 2020 to 2021, using the same census numbers that Nimo dropped in for us, they had a 6.3 decline. So Texas, Georgetown had a 10% increase. Mm-hmm. SF had a 6.3 decline. And so the census report kind of ranked the top 15 growing metros and the bottom 15 declining metros. So I looked into those numbers just to see where the other cities were. And the crazy part about it was that 5 of the cities on that bottom 15 list were in the San Francisco Bay Area. Mm. So Daly City, 3% decline, Redwood City, 3% decline, San Mateo, Cupertino, and South San Francisco all had 3% declines. And so SF had the 6%, but then all of their little suburban towns around it also had 3% declines. And so that is letting you know they're not just leaving the city, they're leaving the region. Yeah. So something is going on in that region that's considering people to say, okay, I had enough. Mm-hmm. So then we looked at New York and DC just to have a comparison. Mm-hmm. And so SF decline was 6%. New York was 2.8 and DC was 3.8. And so cities haven't fared out well in the pandemic, but I wonder how much it'll shake out. The thing I wanted to point out with those numbers was that San Francisco between 2018 and 2019 also had similar declines. And so Petumala, Palo Alto, and Cupertino were all cities in that bottom 15 list comparing 2018 to 2019. And so what I took from that was that COVID was an accelerator, right? So people were leaving this Bay Area prior to the pandemic. And when the pandemic came, they said, okay, this is it. Yeah. This is my time to actually take this move. And so when you think about, well, why would people want to leave San Francisco? You think about housing affordability, which is like literally a crisis. You think about environmental concerns. You might think about traffic, fires, like all these different things. And so you take COVID and you throw it in there and it's like, okay, that was it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I know personally just, a lot of people who made major life changes and moves in the pandemic and spurred different things for them too. One of the articles that I came across was like, who the people that are leaving the city or moving into the city. Mm-hmm. And the census that actually showed that young white adults are actually leaving San Francisco the most. But older Asian adults over the age of 70 are actually moving in. Like they're retiring. And
we did have this conversation.
Yeah, it's interesting to see. And I haven't spent a lot of time in San Francisco, but I wonder what that just looks like on a daily basis, like what you see when you're out and about.
Right, but I think we're at that point where, right, we had our elderly in planning episode, and we talked about the things that persons of age need. Like they need walkability, they need services. And so you can't get that in Salt Lake City. No. You can't get that far out, 30 miles from the city. You have to be kind of core to get those services. So that swap to me makes sense. You talked about Georgetown's budget and how they were impacted. So I'll bring up San Francisco's. Their fiscal year 2021 to 2022, when you could go to Nimo to tell you when that begins and ends, was $145 million. Sounds like a whole lot of money to me. Yeah. But that was 20% less than their budget for fiscal year 2020 to 2021. And so you're losing your population. And so now you have to estimate or plan for a smaller budget, a 20% smaller budget. And so just a 6%, that was interesting to me. Like a 6% decline of population resulted in you decreasing your budget, your planned spending, or your planned revenue by 20%. Yeah. And then you talked about Georgetown increasing theirs by 14%, like year over year. It's just crazy to think about how much money we actually spend on a daily basis.
Right. And if you also look back to last season, we had a how-to episode on like picking where to live, right? And if you are, listening and thinking about, like I said, thinking about places to move, and you're hearing that San Francisco has 20% less budget, you might see more cracks in your sidewalk. You might not get the type of, your neighborhood might be a little bit less clean. Maybe they cut back on street sweeping. You might just have, what does that mean for safety too? If there are less public safety available, if you call 911 in an emergency, how quick are they going to get to you? Like, those are things that I would think about if I'm thinking about moving into a city that's not booming. And I'm in a place in my life where I do want to live in a place that is accelerating, and there are people moving in and it's vibrant.
And when you think about what happens when there's a budget cut, right? They're not cutting police, they're not cutting fire. So you see those programmings maybe in the parks, or you see schools.
Yeah.
That's where you're going to see the impact. And so when you have that population decline, then that has equity. You know who's going to be impacted the most by a budget cut. That means they're going to stop going to certain neighborhoods to do certain things, but they're going to make sure they go to the other ones. And we already know how that kind of functions. And so let's jump into our kind of takeaways. We want to go there?
Yeah, so I think a lot of what we talked about is people leaving. Like, we've spent this episode talking about people coming out. And so Richard Florida, what is he the father of? I know we read about him all the
time. Planning, seeing you. Isn't that Richard Florida?
Yeah, but the creative class. I think he's known for discussing the creative class, and that's really like the people who we think about when we think about gentrification, who's moving in. He defined them as the creative class, and these are the things they want.
That's a nice way to put it.
Right. That's why I always remember him. And so he wrote an article, Cities in a Post-COVID World, and he talked a lot about social scarring, and really meaning that we live in fear. Like, the pandemic put us in a place of fear for 2+ years. Even still, like, I mean, I don't want to get sick on a daily basis. You're on an airplane, you hear someone sneeze, it's like, can you not?
Did you wear your mask on the plane?
I did.
Okay.
I did.
I'm doing a little survey to see who's still wearing a mask on planes.
And I'm thankful that people I was sitting by were also wearing their mask. The woman next to me wasn't. But yeah, I'm like, it's like, but a lot of the airports,
it's a little too tight for me personally.
Yeah, I'm just like, I don't want to share like airspace anymore, which is what he was talking about. Like, we feel fear even in crowds. I'm just like, I'm feeling like again, it's something about the breath. Like, I feel like I'm crossing people's breath too much. Like, I need to put my mask on.
Okay.
I will put my mask on. So yeah, so there's a fear. We think about these things now. And so he says this is likely to influence residents' choice, travel, commute patterns, and the economic viability of certain businesses and social gathering spaces. And with that, people are moving back to the suburbs. Is basically what he concluded. And I think that's important to think about. Again, we mentioned earlier how cities that were either smaller or in different parts of the country, how are they accommodating for this growth? And so Gateway and Natural Resource Amenities, GNAR, the NAR initiative, they've been doing a lot of research and providing technical assistance for cities that have been doing this. Of note, they looked at they called it the Western Gateway.
Okay.
So cities on the western part of the country. We've also heard a lot about Phoenix, Arizona. You mentioned Utah, other places in the West that people have been thinking about moving to. And so they're either getting heavy tourism or migration. And so this research and toolkits that they offer are tips for how to have manageable growth. Specifically, the Western Gateway, I would recommend the webinar that you can find if you look up this initiative in our show notes. And what they're trying to address is housing affordability, traffic congestion, impacts on community character, and natural resources. So really those things we talked about in the beginning of who cares about this. Residents, how are they going to be able to get around once their city overnight becomes, having increase in population. And then the environment too is when you have the increased traffic, when you have increased construction to accommodate for the housing that's coming up. I know I always think about me just consistently moving into the deer's home and cannot be surprised when the deer and the raccoons come back to get
or the
us.
bears.
Right. So yeah, what does that really look like? I think it's just important to be mindful of the quality of life and the sacrifices that you make, whether that's letting the fear take you out of the city, which is fine, or whether you stay in the city and cope with maybe the maybe not so nice things that come with living in overpopulated space. And so just kind of making those trade-offs.
Well, for context, we both made a move during the pandemic. You doubled down on DC area.
Yeah.
I switched coast. Both landed in cities still. So like maybe we're an anomaly. Maybe we're like a minority population. So it's just interesting when I meet people. I've met some people who've made that move to Denver out of LA and different places, but I've also met people who've like bought a house here in LA and like, this is where I'm going to stay. So I think it's now comes down to your personal preference. I think we're in that place where it's like normalized. and we're in that personal preference. And so,
well, and I wanted to add too,
mhm.
I always say, like, I thought I was before the pandemic, I was like, maybe I'll move to Texas. Like, I'll see what Texas has to offer. And something about the pandemic helped me appreciate DC. I got to experience more of the nature. I went hiking a lot more. I got to see places like Navy Yard without traffic. I could find a parking spot. You know, I could scoot if I wanted to and not feel like I was gonna. There was just less cars on the road, so I felt more comfortable to use different forms of transportation. And it just made me appreciate. I really just like. I don't want to be cliche, but I just fell in love with the city. But it just made me appreciate it in different ways. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna stay here for a while. So that was like my
No,
experience.
I think that's I think that everyone can appreciate that perspective, because I think that's something, right? You just watch the news that's not talked about. Like,
Yeah.
it makes it like cities were the worst place to be. And
Right.
it's like, really not. I was in the suburbs throughout the whole pandemic, and I hated it. It was the worst experience ever. And I would go to New York, I would go to Princeton, I would go to the city just because I wanted to be in that urban environment. It's like, my neighborhood realized, oh, we need sidewalks now. Like, we need speed humps now.
Y'all got sidewalks during...
We did get
Oh,
sidewalks.
wow.
Yeah. And so we didn't have them my whole life. I grew without sidewalks. And so we had an opposite. Like, I moved into a city after living in the suburbs throughout the whole pandemic, because it was just, I did not appreciate it at all. Like, it wasn't a good experience. And so it's just interesting to see. But we're also planners.
Right.
So we have a deep love for the city. My biggest takeaway is the focus on neighborhoods, right? And so that's what we talked about. When you're not going to that central business district and you're spending more of your day, right? So you're going to office 5 days a week. That means you're spending 40 or 60 or 80 hours of your week away from your house, away from your residential neighborhood where you live. And now you're going to be at your house all of that time. And so your concern for what goes on in your neighborhood is now more important.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
I'd be out looking out the window.
Because you're there
at 2 o'clock. Like, what's going on?
And so what that comes down to is when cities think about their investment in parks and public spaces and streets and roads, that tends to focus on, that central business district, whether that's downtown DC or Navy Yard, or whether it's Century City or Beverly Hills. But now you have to focus on neighborhoods, because that's where people are most times of the day. So you can't do all your programming and your park redesign at the main park. You have to go into those smaller neighborhoods and try to say, okay, well, they need street trees, they need benches, they need garbage cans, the same way that your downtown did, because this is now people are spending more of their time. And so it changes kind of our investment strategy to be more neighborhood and people focused rather than more business focused. And then the other takeaway for me was, what do we do with all this office space?
Yeah.
Right? We talked about some companies just not coming back into the office. Some companies going into a hybrid. Some companies taking up less space. So instead of having 1,000 square feet, now they only need 500. And so there's going to be whole office buildings that are vacant. You drive down Wilshire, there's going to be office buildings that are vacant. We also have people living on the street.
Yeah.
I feel like this is an opportunity for us to do something that can be impactful moving forward. We're going to have a lot of buildings that already have water infrastructure. They already have electricity infrastructure. They don't need to be a brand new construction. And there's difficulty from like an architecture perspective of converting an office into housing.
Did you see examples of places that were either doing that before COVID?
Yeah, so I did. I saw a couple that were doing it before COVID, but I think the biggest players in it now are California. I saw that Governor Newsom added $400 million in his budget allocation for 2023-2024, specifically for initiatives for developers to convert office space into affordable housing.
Okay. DC
government also has an office to affordable housing task force, which they interestingly created in 2019. And so there's a lot of, I think cities have realized they're going to have an issue. One way or another, they're going to have an issue.
Yeah.
If their offices are vacant, they're not getting that revenue from their property taxes. And your people on the street, you're not getting the appeal that you want. This is both beneficial for the city in terms of like the actual city government and also the residents. And so it's an opportunity. I think a lot of governments, you'll see that moving forward. A lot of places are going to be putting money towards and offering incentives to developers to do that. And I would like to see it happen at a federal level. Maybe we advance the low income housing tax credit program to like, oh, if you do this, you get extra tax credits if you do it in an office space conversion.
Yeah, I think with that, I would definitely like to see a lot of thought put to the intended people that they want to live. Like you're saying, people, people who are experiencing homelessness. how do we make those spaces feel inviting? Because I've seen a lot of cities build affordable housing or short-term housing for people who are experiencing homelessness. But that means they can't bring their stuff with them. Maybe they don't have safe places if they have a substance abuse issue that they're working through. And so I think they really would have to, I think they call it wraparound services. Like, I would like to see those places consider the populations that they really want to be served, so that it's not just like, it doesn't just turn into like chic apartments for people who could live anywhere, or people that would just live in maybe a traditional residential building.
No, I think that's important. I think they have to be considerate into the strategy that they choose. But I think, we talked about this in our budget episode, wherever they put money, that's when they mean business. So you can create a task force, you can create a little study, show me where it's in your budget. That's when I know you're serious about this initiative.
Right, exactly. Well, thank you all for joining us for our first episode of season 3. We've been in this now since 2020. We started, but we've been, 2023 will basically make 4 years that we've been discussing the idea of this podcast. So it's nice to always be able to come together. We've been trying to figure out the last time we actually saw each other.
I think it was the last time we recorded.
Yeah, we see each other on camera like at least once a week, every other week, if not. And so you can follow us on the number 4 Degrees Pod on Instagram and Twitter. And we are also, you can also send us an email.
We've gotten some emails, right? So it's exciting.
Yeah, if you look in our show notes, you can find all the information on this episode, our sources, and then also where to contact us.
Well, peace out, y'all.